Hello and welcome to this episode of the Housing Geospatial podcast, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything that relates to either housing and or geospatial, preferably if there's a little bit of both. Housing Geospatial was formed as we believe place matters for social housing and that geospatial information is woefully underrepresented within the housing sector. This series is around sharing a collective of knowledge for those within the housing sector. You can find us either on our group page on LinkedIn or feel free to head on over to our website at www.housinggeospatial.co.uk. I'm your host, Chris Kinnear, and our guest for this podcast is the highly forward-thinking Sam McCarthy, who is the business lead at AiDASH. Hi, Sam. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
So, first of all, how are you involved in either housing and or geospatial?
Yeah, good question. I suppose every housing development in England now has this mandate to demonstrate 10% uplift in biodiversity before it gets planning permission. That became a mandatory obligation in February 2024. The very first step in meeting that obligation is understanding what habitats exist on the land today, what's there, what condition they're in, and how much of that is there. That's fundamentally a geospatial problem. What we do at AiDASH is we use commercial grade satellite imagery and AI to automate that mapping. Under the hood, it's a land cover classification. We're taking satellite imagery where you can see individual trees and hedgerow boundaries, and our AI models are classifying that into habitat polygons that map into the DEFRA statutory metric, which is that methodology that underpins how you quantify biodiversity. So it's a geospatial workflow, like through and through, but it's one that's purpose-built for environmental compliance within the housing sector. We work primarily with house builders, housing associations, strategic land teams, and then the ecology consultancies that serve them. Increasingly also with the local planning authorities themselves, who need to validate what developers are actually submitting as part of that process. So we sit at the point where geospatial data meets housing delivery, meets environmental regulation.
Okay, so that's really cool, and we'll get more into that later on. You've had quite an interesting career that's led you to being here at AiDASH. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So you can probably hear from my accent, I'm originally from Australia. I came over to the UK about 8 years ago, and I came from a business development background. I'm not an ecologist by training, which I think is actually relevant for the listeners, because what's happened with biodiversity's net gain is that it's taken a very technical, very ecological requirement and dropped it into the middle of the commercial housing process. Suddenly everyone involved, the land directors, the planners, the housing associations, sustainability teams, they all need to understand ecology, planning law, and geospatial data to do their jobs properly. That's kind of the journey that I've been on. So I joined AiDASH back in early stages of 2022 as a kind of new business commercial function. And at the time, the product category was being invented alongside the legislation. B&G then went mandatory for the major sites in Feb 2024, and then the small sites in April. So I've essentially been on this building a market that didn't exist 2.5 years ago. A lot of the mature organizations were looking at biodiversity much prior to this, but the actual mandatory obligation came in 2024. That's meant learning ecology, learning the planning system, learning how developers appraise land, learning how housing associations procure, and then bringing all of that together into something commercial. I mean, it keeps things interesting that AiDASH isn't just a UK business. The parent company, which is a satellite-first intelligence platform, works globally. We have multiple products within our suite: utilities, vegetation management, land management, asset inspection, wildfire and disaster mitigation across multiple different countries globally. So the technology behind what we do is for B&G has been developed and validated at much larger scale than just England. Kind of gives us that depth of capability you don't really get from a scale up, we call ourselves. That's been built purely around the B&G legislation, but that gives you an idea. And then, I mean, early stages of my career, I was in accounting and finance, so bit of a change from my side.
You know what? It's an interesting one when we talk about housing. A lot of us who work in housing stumbled into it. We were doing
Yeah.
something else and we came into it. So you talked a little bit about your parent company being a satellite imagery company, but AiDASH, and you've touched about BNG and things. Let's get a bit more specific in terms of products and services. What are those key services that you offer, especially for UK housing associations?
Yes. So I mean, I think the main offering, I think I usually start with the problem because that's important, and then I'll put it in relation to the actual product itself. So BNGAI is the product, Biodiversity Net Gain AI, and it's a product from AiDASH, which is the parent company.
Mm.
And I think that's probably the most relevant one for the listeners. AiDASH has about 8 different products that all use satellite imagery as a primary data source. For the BNGAI product, the traditional approach to an environmental assessment is incredibly manual. If you're an ecologist and someone hands you a site, you're pulling data from 10 different data sources like magic maps and local records and soil databases, designated sites, and then manually digitizing habitat boundaries in GIS, classifying everything, and then collating it into a report. So for a large site, this can take weeks, if not months, and every ecology firm in the country is doing this the same way at the moment. What BNGAI does is automate that data heavy part of the process. We take commercial satellite imagery, really, really high resolution. When most people think satellite imagery, they think Google Maps. This is distinctly different from that, a much higher resolution. And then we run it through our proprietary AI models that are trained on over 100,000 ecological sites. The AI classifies every habitat against the statutory metric or a classification system. I'll use the DEFRA one in this case. So there's about 180 different habitats within that classification system. The AI draws the polygon, the boundaries, so it does the delineation or the segmentation between habitats. It assigns it a condition, and then it delivers a GIS-ready shapefile and a collated report. We also, of course, have a software where we host this, which is BNGAI. We are a software development company at our core. I think critically, all of the outputs are verified by our in-house ecology team, which is a core function before it comes back to the client. So it's not a black box. It's an AI-powered first draft that has a qualified ecologist checked and signed off. We offer a couple of different tiers of service is the way that I like to describe it. So a really early stage feasibility and due diligence tool. That's the kind of quick, low cost option when a developer needs to understand the BNG position before committing to a land bid. We offer like a platform license for ecology firms who want to integrate the data into their own field work, and then a full end-to-end service which operates more like a traditional boots on the ground. Much smaller component of our business, but is still there. Some other kind of things that we do within the BNGI product is monitoring, which is a huge topic at the moment. Essentially change detection between satellite passes over time becomes quite important because BNG is a 30-year monitoring obligation. That's not like a planning hurdle that goes away once you get consent. It's a 3-decade-long management commitment, and the monitoring piece is where the geospatial technology really comes into its own. So I think I touched on it at the very start. BNG is flagship in England, but the underlying technology isn't just a BNG tool. We position it as like a nature intelligence layer is the way that I describe it. So the same data powers, constraints mapping, preliminary ecological appraisals form into corporate reports like TNFD, SBTN, CSRD. These are all relatively new to me, but I'm learning them as I go. We're delivering these assessments globally for major corporate clients right now. BNG is the entry point, but the platform works on any piece of land, anywhere.
I think one thing before we crack on, we in the podcast have spoken about BNG quite a bit. Really quickly, for someone who's not heard this before, what is BNG and why is it really important for development now in terms of UK planning law?
Yeah, good question. So BNG, or Biodiversity Net Gain, is a mandatory planning obligation that came into play in 2024. In its premise, it essentially means you need to leave the land in a better state than it was post-development. providing a net gain or an environmental enhancement on site. That means that you've got to understand, well, what's on that prospective piece of land now? What's your baseline biodiversity? If you're going to put forward a development, how does that development negatively impact that baseline? And then after the development has gone through, how are you going to deliver your baseline plus 10%? So it's all around, the holistic premise was that there was degradation of land across the UK, across, many, many previous years. So we needed an environmental policy or legislation to essentially recuperate and deliver, nature positivity. This is where B&G came in. It was being tracked and done by forward-thinking organisations pre-legislation, but the mandatory obligation under the Environment Act mean that it was a requirement rather than a nice to have, so to speak.
Okay, so B&G really important for UK developers. There's a lot of we were talking before where if you're off by even like a few meters squared, it has massive legal ramifications.
Yeah.
So it's really great to see you've got a classification tool that will automatically doing it. I think the thing that's really key, especially from my perspective, is you do ground truthing with your ecologist, which I think is a really clever move. So at the moment, you're working with a few housing organisations and developers. How are you working alongside with them, or how are they using your services?
Yeah, good question. So there's two distinct conversations here because the actual B&G obligation lands very differently depending on which side of the table you're on. For the developers and the house builders, the B&G is a direct planning obligation. You cannot get consent without demonstrating that 10% uplift. So for them, our platform is about speed and certainty in the planning process. A land director looking at a potential acquisition needs to know the B&G position before they commit capital. What are the habitats on site? What's the likely cost of achieving net gain? Is this site going to need expensive off-site units, which I can talk through in more, or can they deliver on-site? We give them that answer in a couple of days rather than the traditional weeks or months, which means they can appraise land with true environmental costs baked in from day one. It's around de-risking and protecting GDV from their perspective. So there's no surprises in 6 months into the planning process. We also work with the environmental consultancies that serve that development sector. They use our platform to get the data-heavy baseline work done faster. It's like an operational efficiency driver for them. So they're ecologists, which is a primary role in this space, spend more time on the higher value field work, like you mentioned, and the professional judgment rather than sitting in a screen and digitalizing polygons. That's one side. The other side is the housing associations, which is a little bit different. Most associations acquire their new homes through a Section 106 agreement with the developer. They're buying units off plan. In that model, the B&G compliance still sits with the developer, not the housing association. So the direct planning obligation isn't theirs, but there's two areas where it does become relevant. The first is due diligence on those acquisitions. So even though B&G sits with the house builder contractually, housing association is still committing significant capital to purchase those units. They can use the platform, and how they have been using the platform is doing an independent check on whether the developer, B&G position is actually viable before they sign. A weak B&G position can delay or derail a planning application, and that directly impacts the association's delivery program and their development pipeline. The second and kind of bigger long-term opportunity on the association side of things is the existing estate. So some of the largest housing associations here in the UK have substantial land portfolios across their communities. Green spaces, grounds, land between blocks, amenity areas, legacy sites. There's kind of a real growing pressure to demonstrate measurable biodiversity outcomes as part of sustainability commitments and social value reporting. So we see a lot of associations that are already targeting voluntary biodiversity uplift across existing communities each year. Others have achieved, significant habitat gains. We're working with one who's done 30% uplift, is the number that comes to mind. So the appetite is definitely there. The challenge is knowing which sites in a portfolio of, hundreds of sites have genuine uplift potential without commissioning a boots on the ground walkover for every single site. And that's kind of where the platform comes in. We screen the estate, we identify the sites, and then we help them show where the quick wins are. So there's that portfolio level dashboarding element as well for sustainability directors who need that group level visibility.
I think the thing that's really interesting there, and I think it's that uplift that you said, that 30% uplift across their entire estate. Orbit said they were doing something quite similar when we had Steve Litchfield on the episode. But I think what's a really good aspect to talk about is off-site units. I think that's a really quick one if anyone doesn't know about it. Can you tell us a little bit about why off-site units are a key part of BNG legislation?
Yeah. So as part of BNG legislation, there's a aspect that's called the mitigation hierarchy, which means first and foremost, you need to try and deliver your net gain on site. That's the primary. And if you cannot do that, then you have to deliver it off-site. Now, the off-site market operates a little bit like the carbon market, with the key differential is that they want you to deliver or purchase those off-site units as close to the site as possible. Nature is being lost in the UK, therefore it should be replaced in the UK. Those off-site units are like a private market of what's called like habitat banks or unit providers who essentially allocate a piece of land, provide uplift, and then sell those units back to the developers who can't meet the mandatory 10% on site. That offsite market operates like any free market, supply and demand, in which case units have a cost associated with them. Now, unit price fluctuates depending on, is it a poor condition grassland or is it a watercourse, which is on the other end of the spectrum? And they can range anywhere between £20,000, £15,000 on the lower end to hundreds of £1,000s for things like watercourses. So when a developer is assessing a site and they identify, I'm going to be 10 units or 100 units short, they can quickly quantify what their off-site cost is going to be. So that's driven a whole new stream of private investment into off-site habitat banking, which is come purely out of this kind of, the legislation since 2024. So that's how the off-site market works. And then there's a very, very fallback to that. There is a statutory credit market that the government runs. That is the last case resort if you can't find off-site units.
Yeah, I was talking to an ecologist friend of mine recently, and there was a developer and they had to buy off-site credits, and it was quite a lot of money. So, and he tried to convince them to just reduce their scope to make it cheaper for them. But that's a whole different conversation.
They can turn into 6- and 7-figure headaches we've seen from our experience. So, yeah.
So we've talked about how you work with social housing providers, and you gave that fantastic example of a 30% uplift. Do you have any other outcomes that have come through from this?
I suppose the most tangible outcome is something I can point to we're doing right now. So we have a client that's digitizing their entire portfolio, both currently and retrospectively, and bringing it into the platform. So every site that was previously assessed by a different ecology firm sitting in disconnected spreadsheets and GIS files across all these consultancies is being brought into one, call it like an auditable digital record, which is the platform. Once that's done, the sustainability team has a portfolio view across their entire program. That's like a general, like a kind of a genuine operational shift when you're managing dozens of sites across multiple regions with constrained resources. More broadly, though, I'd frame the outcomes around 3 things that matter to people, for people who are making decisions. First is ROI, return on investment, and speed. What traditionally takes 6 to 8 weeks can be delivered with us from 1 to 3 days. That compression alone changes how organizations can operate. You can screen multiple sites in the time it used to take to do one. For a land director who's appraising, acquisitions, or an association running due diligence on a development pipeline, that speed translates directly into better informed decisions made earlier in the process. And the cost is significantly more affordable than the traditional approach, which is boots on the ground, which matters when you're not just doing one site, but screening like an entire portfolio. The second one is a key one, which is risk reduction and budget certainty. For housing providers acquiring sites, knowing BNG liability and what I just touched on, the offsite market, where it's really where the cost is incurred at acquisition stage, rather than discovering it after the purchase, is a genuine risk mitigation. You factor in true cost of biodiversity delivery into the kind of financial model from day one. No surprise that planning, for them, that's a measurable return. The avoided cost of stalled planning applications or unexpected offsites, the credit bill can be like substantial. And then I think third, which is something that comes inherently when you use software, is consistency and like auditability. So every assessment, same methodology, same data sources, same reporting format. That standardization is increasingly important because at like board level and regulators, they expect like coherent evidence base. When you're reporting against sustainability targets or demonstrating social value, having a consistent auditable data set across the portfolio is far more defensible than patchwork from different consultancies using different approaches. It gives you, numbers to think about, and all can also feed into annual reporting or disclosures or board papers. So I think they're probably the three main ones, or the three outcomes.
So that's, what I find is that the speed of delivery, I think, is probably the biggest one. Like those of us who have mapped grounds maintenance knows it can take anywhere from like a few hours to like a week to map a big estate. And the fact that you can do it so quickly, and then that combined with the consistency, I think that's really powerful for any housing association. Because mapping grounds maintenance, it gives you the greatest ROI, but equally it is a really expensive process to do. So you've done quite a lot in the past few years.
We have,
especially with this product. How do you see yourselves and maybe the products kind of changing over the next few years? Is it delivering more consistently what you've got? Is it maybe venturing into something new? What's kind of the thinking?
I feel like for my answers, I'm going into 2 or 3 sections, but again, I'm probably going to go to that.
No, that's perfectly fine. Don't worry about it.
It's just my logical way of explaining. And the first one is geographic expansion. BNG is England only, but the underlying technology works globally. So we're already delivering nature assessments across multiple different countries for major corporate clients that I touched on before, mapping into frameworks like TNFD and SBTN and CSRD. The regulatory direction globally is towards mandatory nature reporting. Like EU nature restoration law requires member states to submit national restoration plans by September this year. Australia, where I'm from, already has its own biodiversity assessment requirements. So the demand for scale is there. Consistent nature data is forming into multiple markets like simultaneously. We've built the tech. We are framework agnostic as to what we map into. We're not hard coded into the English metric. So that's something we're definitely exploring at the moment. The second is, rather than just the baseline, is that monitoring, that piece, that change detection over time. And I think it's probably one of the most relevant to the audience who might be listening today, that BNG is a 30-year monitoring obligation for every development that goes through planning. We're 2 years in since it went mandatory. Thousands of sites have been through and done biodiversity net gain compliance, and every single one of those needs monitoring for 3 decades. The traditional model of sending an ecologist out to walk every single site year on year, there's already not enough ecologists in the UK to tackle the current challenge. If you think about the hockey stick of what's going to be required in year 1 versus year 5, you've got incrementally more sites that are going to need this ground truthing assessment. So I think that's something that we're looking to tackle. We're building that capacity now to do monitoring via remote sensing, and I think we'll hopefully become that monitoring backbone for a significant part of the industry. And then I think the third thing is the deepening integration between software and ecology services. I've had talks with ecologists so many times in the past, and I think sometimes when people hear ecology and AI in the same sentence, the red flags go up, which is absolutely warranted, and skepticism is good. Because we're not just a software company, we do have that full in-house ecology team, and we're building a model where a single point of contact for all ecology services across a client's portfolio. So software is the data layer. Ecologists for the field work is where we envisage it going. That kind of single supplier model is really attractive to a lot of housing providers who don't want to manage multiple kind of different firms. And then one thing I'll flag, because it's current, the government announced significant B&G changes a couple of weeks back, and kind of a new 0.2 hectare exemption coming in at what's proposed for the 31st of July. We will see. That will remove B&G requirements from roughly half of the residential planning permissions. There's also kind of live consultation at the moment on exempting brownfield residential sites. So the policy is simplifying for smaller sites, which is potentially the right direction. But for any meaningful development, which is where the housing volume sits, we've all heard this 1.5 million homes, the obligation remains, and the monitoring obligation is 30 years. So the technology isn't going away. If anything, it's just concentrating on the sites that matter most.
Okay. I really like the final point there of kind of deepening that relationship between ecologists and AI.
Yeah.
Offline, I think on this as well, we've talked about how AI usage for people taking it as ground truth certainty is not the right. I think you're doing that right mix of, we've got ecologists, here's the software, we'll validate it externally, and it's that kind of confidence building as well, which I think is really powerful.
Yeah.
We're going to get on to our penultimate question now, which is, what advice would you give to housing professionals who are starting to get to grips with BNG?
Good question, and I'll caveat by saying I'm not a housing professional, so take my advice with a grain of salt, but I have been in the sector for a while now, and I've been through iterations of metrics and the way that it's approached. The biggest thing I'd say is that don't treat B&G as just a planning hurdle. It's not a box that you tick at application stage and forget about it. It's a 30-year land management commitment. Every site that goes through planning now carries monitoring obligations for 3 decades. That changes the conversation from what do I need to do now to get consent to what am I signing up to manage for the next 30 years. Practically, I mean, get the data early is what we always say. The earlier you understand the B&G position on a site, the more options you have and the lower the cost. Discovering a difficult baseline 6 months into the planning process is expensive. Discovering it before you've committed the land deal is just information. So I think above that, secondly, think portfolio, not project. If you're, a housing association or a volume house builder, you're not dealing with B&G on one site. You're dealing with dozens or potentially hundreds over time. Having a consistent approach and a single view across all of them is going to save you an enormous amount of time and money compared to, managing on a site-by-site basis. And the third thing is I feel like I'm repeating myself on the monitoring, but don't underestimate it. The industry is very focused on the baseline and the planning right now. And that's because it's the immediate need and the immediate challenge. but the monitoring obligation is building quietly in the background. We're starting to see it come forward now. Thousands of sites, 30 years each. The organizations that get ahead of it now, that set up like proper monitoring infrastructure rather than waiting until it becomes a problem, they're the ones who will be in the strongest position. As it's the penultimate question, I suppose the overarching point is that, BNG is ultimately, it's a geospatial challenge. The people in this audience already think in maps and spatial data. That's the right lens for this. The organizations that treat BNG as a data problem rather than just an ecology problem are the ones that are getting the best outcomes.
I think that's a really powerful way to say BNG is a geospatial.
Yeah.
And I think it's right. And especially when you're saying, there's a quote I wrote earlier on of, don't treat it as a planning hurdle. It's all about land management. And I think that's probably one of the best ways I've ever heard it described. So as it's the final question, as always, if you had an unlimited budget, what would you do with it?
Yeah. Proper answer first, then the honest one. First, I think, being in the space, open access national habitat map of England, single, continuously updated, satellite-derived view of every habitat in the country, freely available to every planning authority, every association, every community group. We have the tech to do it right now. But at the moment, habitat data in England it's fragmented, it's outdated, and it's expensive to access. Local authorities trying to validate BNG submissions without a clear picture of what's actually going on the ground in their area. If we fix that one thing, it would fundamentally change how every development approaches nature. That's like the infrastructure investment that would pay for itself many, many times over. And then second, monitor it. Right now, satellite monitoring is periodic. You take a snapshot, you compare it to the last snapshot. What I want is if this is my unlimited budget, is a near real-time layer where every BNG site in England just shows up on a dashboard, green, amber, red status based on the last year's satellite pass or yesterday's satellite pass. So, the habitat bank manager, the local authority, the developer, they can all see instantly whether a site is on track or something needs attention. The third, R&D, research funding. We're at the moment, we're at about 90% alignment with field survey is where our accuracy sits, which is good, but there are still habitat types, like particularly certain types of grassland classifications, where the distinction between one category and another is genuinely difficult from remote sensing. Every percentage point of improvement translates into less corrective field work. So I'd want more research done into partnerships with universities, the ecology community, because the faster we are to close that gap, the more the whole industry benefits. And then for my honest answer, stepping back from work, being from Australia, I think a direct flight from London to Sydney, no emission or low emission, would be would be great. And if I've got the cash, then why not put some houses for my friends and family at either location so we can just go back and forth. So yeah, that's my little honest answer at the end.
I think that's great. One of the previous guests said they would buy a little farm and just live on that.
Also, look, why not throw it in there?
Sam, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fantastic having you on today and chat about the work you do. If anyone who's listened today wishes to get in touch, what's the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, sure. So bng.ai, simple as that. Go to the website and hit get in contact with us, and we'd be more than happy to speak. I think that is probably the simplest and easiest way.
No worries. And to those of you who've been listening today, thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to get involved in the podcast, please feel free to get in touch. You can find us either on LinkedIn or you visit our website at www.housinggeospatial.co.uk. Thank you so much, Sam, once again. And to those of you listening, thank you very much and have a good day.
Thanks, Chris.